Morrison, you step 1 foot outside this perimeter, and I'll have you court-martialed for insubordination. We do not risk more American lives for men who are already gone." Colonel Marcus Webb screamed those words at a 51-year-old Master Chief Petty Officer who had just volunteered to infiltrate through Mogadishu's underground storm drainage system to reach 5 wounded soldiers trapped in a crashed Black Hawk compound. The 42-year-old Army Ranger commander saw him as just another Navy hotshot who didn't understand urban warfare, a reckless veteran who would compromise their position in what intelligence called a certain death mission through militia-controlled territory. But in exactly 90 seconds, when Staff Sergeant Kevin Park's voice would crack over the radio with his final transmission, "Pilots bleeding out, we got maybe 10 minutes left," that insubordinate Master Chief would be the only man with both the skill and the determination to defy direct orders, disappear into a flooded tunnel system crawling with enemy fighters, and emerge 2 hours later carrying wounded soldiers to safety, proving that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism happen when experience chooses conscience over command. Before we dive into this untold story from Mogadishu in October 1993, where Master Chief Frank Morrison faced the choice between military orders and saving American lives during the Battle of Mogadishu, tell us in the comments, have you ever had to choose between following authority and doing what your experience told you was right? And if you believe that true leadership sometimes means standing alone against command when soldiers' lives hang in the balance, hit that subscribe button because this story will show you the moment that defined what it means to be a Navy SEAL and the price one Master Chief paid for putting his men above his career. The wheelchair creaked softly as 68-year-old Frank Morrison rolled closer to the window of the VA Medical Center in Sacramento. Outside, the October afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, the same golden light that had painted the dusty streets of Mogadishu exactly 17 years ago. "You're quiet today, Frank," said Dr. Sarah Martinez, adjusting the IV drip connected to the frail veteran in the bed beside him. Danny Sullivan, former Army Ranger, recipient of 2 Purple Hearts, and the same man Frank had carried through flooded tunnels in 1993, managed a weak smile despite the cancer treatments that had stolen his strength. "Just remembering October," Frank replied, his weathered hands folding in his lap. The silver star on his jacket caught the light, one of 3 bronze stars accompanying it, medals that told stories most people would never hear. Danny's voice was barely a whisper. "Mogadishu?" Frank nodded. "Been thinking about that tunnel system, about Webb's orders, about you bleeding out in that compound." A young Army lieutenant passing by glanced at Frank dismissively. Just another old veteran living in the past. The same look Colonel Webb had given him 26 years earlier when Frank had stripped off his gear and headed for the storm drains. "Tell me the story again," Danny requested, his eyes closing. "The real version, not the sanitized report they put in our files." Frank's jaw tightened slightly. The real version. The version where a Master Chief Petty Officer had risked court-martial, compromised a mission, and violated every rule of engagement to save 5 soldiers the Army had already written off as casualties. "October 3rd, 1993, Frank began, his voice steady despite the weight of the memories. "Day 14 of Operation Gothic Serpent. You boys were supposed to be back at base by sundown. The heat was suffocating even by Somali standards." Master Chief Petty Officer Frank Morrison, at 51 years old, moved with the measured precision of a man who had spent 26 years perfecting the art of underwater warfare. His desert camouflage uniform bore the chevrons and anchor of his rank, the highest enlisted position in the Navy, and the weathered face beneath his desert cap showed the accumulated experience of Vietnam River operations, Cold War submarine rescues, and Gulf War coastal infiltrations. The temporary command post buzzed with controlled chaos. Radio chatter crackled with desperate updates from the downed Black Hawk crash site, while intelligence officers moved red pins across aerial photographs of Mogadishu's urban maze. "Sir, Super 6-4 is confirmed down," reported Lieutenant Mitchell, his face pale with exhaustion. Pilot and co-pilot both alive but wounded. Door gunner and 2 Rangers took defensive positions in the adjacent building. Colonel Marcus Webb, 42 years old, West Point graduate and veteran of Panama and Desert Storm, studied the tactical display with the cold calculation that had earned him his Eagles. To him, urban warfare was a chess game played with human pieces, and every move had to serve the larger strategic objective. Distance from nearest friendly forces, Webb asked, his Kentucky accent clipped with authority. 800 meters through active militia territory, came the reply. Intelligence estimates 40 to 60 fighters between our position and the crash site. Frank stepped forward from where he'd been studying drainage maps liberated from the old Italian colonial administration building. Sir, request permission to reconnoiter an alternate route. Webb barely glanced at the Navy SEAL. Inter-service rivalry ran deep, and Army Rangers had little patience for Navy personnel who thought they understood ground operations. Master Chief, this is urban warfare, not a beach landing. We handle our own. With respect, Colonel, Frank replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that came with being the most senior enlisted man in the Joint Task Force. I've been studying Mogadishu's infrastructure since we arrived. The Italians built an extensive storm drainage system in the 1930s. It runs directly under the crash site. Webb's expression hardened. Frank Morrison was a living legend among Special Operations Forces. Silver Star from Vietnam, classified missions in the North Atlantic, rumors of operations that would remain buried in Pentagon files for another 50 years. But legends didn't change the tactical reality on the ground. The drainage system is flooded from seasonal rains, Webb said dismissively. Intel reports show water levels at 6 to 8 feet. It's impassable. Frank's gray eyes, the same eyes that had navigated the Mekong Delta's deadliest currents, met Webb's steadily. Sir, I've swum through worse conditions than that. In Vietnam, This isn't Vietnam, Master Chief. Webb interrupted. This is an Army operation in urban terrain. We extract our people our way. The radio crackled with Staff Sergeant Kevin Park's voice, strained with pain and barely controlled panic. Command, this is Ranger Base. Pilots got internal bleeding. Co-pilots unconscious. We're taking sporadic fire from multiple positions. Request immediate medical evacuation. Webb keyed his microphone. Ranger Base, maintain defensive positions. Relief force is en route. Frank studied the tactical display, his mind calculating angles, distances, and infiltration routes with the precision of a man who had spent 3 decades turning impossible missions into successful operations. The crash site sat in an urban valley, surrounded on 3 sides by multi-story buildings that provided perfect overwatch for militia fighters. Any direct assault would be a bloodbath. But 8 feet below the street level, the Italian engineers had carved tunnels wide enough for maintenance crews. Tunnels that followed the natural drainage pattern straight to the compound, where 5 American soldiers waited for rescue or death. Colonel, Frank said quietly, give me 30 minutes to reach that compound through the drainage system. I can assess casualties, provide medical stabilization, and guide your relief force to the optimal entry point. Webb's patience finally snapped. The pressure of command, the weight of American lives, and the political implications of losing soldiers in a humanitarian mission had stretched his nerves to the breaking point. God damn it, Morrison. This is not a Navy SEAL publicity stunt. Those tunnels are a death trap, flooded, unmapped, and probably crawling with militia fighters who know every inch of this city. Sir, with respect. No. Webb's voice carried the absolute authority of command. I will not risk additional American lives on a cowboy mission through flooded sewers. We extract our people with overwhelming force and proper tactical support. Frank glanced at the tactical display, where red pins marked known militia positions between the command post and the crash site. Overwhelming force meant a frontal assault through 800 meters of urban terrain, with American soldiers exposed to crossfire from rooftops, windows, and doorways. It meant casualties, probably significant casualties. The radio crackled again. Command. Pilot's pulse is weakening. Co-pilot still unconscious. We need medical assistance now. Webb studied his options, all of them bad. The relief force would need another hour to organize properly, time the wounded didn't have. A hasty assault would cost lives, but losing the helicopter crew would be a political disaster that could end the entire humanitarian mission. Master Chief, Webb said finally, his voice carrying the weight of impossible decisions, you are ordered to remain at this command post and provide liaison support for Navy assets. Is that understood? Frank's weathered face showed no emotion, but something flickered behind his gray eyes. the same look he'd worn in the Mekong Delta when Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell had forbidden him from rescuing those Marines. 26 years later, different war, different commander, same choice between orders and lives. Understood, sir. But understanding and compliance were different things entirely. Frank Morrison had spent 26 years in the Navy, rising from an 18-year-old recruit to the most senior enlisted rank through a combination of skill, courage, and an unshakable commitment to the warrior's creed. No man left behind. He had followed orders through 3 wars, dozens of classified missions, and countless operations where success depended on discipline, precision, and absolute trust in the chain of command. But he had also learned that sometimes, in those crucial moments when lives hung in the balance, experience trumped authority and conscience overruled command. The drainage maps lay spread across the equipment crate, marked with measurements, flow rates, and structural details that told a story Webb couldn't read. Frank saw what the colonel missed. The storm drains weren't just flooded tunnels. They were an infiltration highway that bypassed every militia position between the command post and the crash site. 20 minutes after Webb's direct order, Master Chief Morrison was gone. Lieutenant Mitchell noticed first. "Sir, where's the Master Chief?" Webb spun around, scanning the command post with growing alarm. Frank's gear was missing: desert camouflage jacket, tactical vest, sidearm, and the waterproof medical kit he'd been carrying since Vietnam. "Find him," Webb barked, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew it was too late. Frank Morrison hadn't survived 3 wars by telegraphing his intentions. 8 blocks away, Frank knelt beside a storm drain cover that Italian engineers had installed 60 years earlier. The concrete was worn smooth by decades of seasonal flooding, and the metal grating showed the rust stains that marked Mogadishu's brief but intense rainy seasons. He had shed his uniform jacket and tactical vest, keeping only his sidearm, medical kit, and a waterproof flashlight that had accompanied him through submarine rescues in the North Atlantic. At 51 years old, his body carried the accumulated damage of 3 decades in special operations: surgically repaired shoulders from Vietnam, scar tissue from Gulf War shrapnel, and joints that reminded him daily of every combat dive, every rescue mission, every time he'd pushed human endurance past its breaking point. But his mind remained sharp, calculating water flow, tunnel dimensions, and the complex geometry of underground infiltration with the precision that had made him a legend among SEAL teams. The storm drain was exactly as the maps indicated: 8 feet of fast-flowing water moving through a concrete tunnel, wide enough for 2 men to walk side by side. The current was strong but manageable, and the tunnel walls showed the regular maintenance marks that indicated structural integrity. Frank slipped into the water with the practiced silence of a man who had spent 30 years moving through hostile environments, undetected. The water was surprisingly clean, storm runoff from the city's elevated areas, and the current carried him steadily toward the crash site, at a rate that would put him in the compound in exactly 23 minutes. Behind him, Colonel Webb was discovering that ordering Navy SEALs and controlling Navy SEALs were entirely different challenges. The tunnel system was a marvel of Italian engineering, built to handle Mogadishu's seasonal floods with a network of interconnected channels that drained the city's elevated areas into the Indian Ocean. Frank navigated by compass and intuition, using the subtle changes in water flow and tunnel direction to map his progress through the underground maze. 26 years of special operations had taught him that success often depended on finding the routes other people couldn't see: the underwater approaches, the night infiltrations, the infiltration methods that bypassed conventional defenses entirely. The militia fighters controlling the streets above had positioned themselves to repel a ground assault, not to guard against an underwater approach through forgotten colonial infrastructure. 18 minutes after entering the storm drain, Frank reached a vertical access shaft directly beneath the compound where the Black Hawk had crashed. The shaft was narrow, barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, but it led straight up to a drainage grate 15 feet below street level. Frank surfaced in the shaft with the controlled breathing that had kept him alive through countless combat dives. Above him, he could hear the distinctive crack of AK-47 fire and the measured response of American M16. The wounded soldiers were still alive, still fighting, but time was running out. The vertical climb was the most dangerous part of the infiltration. If militia fighters had discovered the drainage system, the shaft would be a perfect kill zone. but Frank's intelligence proved accurate. The fighters remained focused on the streets above, watching for the conventional assault they expected from American forces. He emerged into the compound's basement through a drainage grate that had been designed for maintenance access, not combat infiltration. The basement was dark, flooded with 2 feet of water from damaged pipes, and filled with the debris of a building that had taken repeated rocket-propelled grenade hits. Above him, Frank could hear voices. American voices, strained with pain and exhaustion, but still maintaining the discipline that separated Rangers from ordinary soldiers. "Park, how's the pilot?" The voice belonged to Sergeant First Class Michael Torres, squad leader and the senior man on site. "Not good, Sarge. Pulse is weak, breathing's shallow, co-pilot's still out. We need medical support now." Frank climbed the stairs to the first floor, his sidearm drawn and his medical kit ready. The compound had been a small office building before the war, 3 stories of concrete and steel that now served as an impromptu fortress for 5 American soldiers who had expected to be home for dinner. "Rangers," Frank called softly, using the voice tone that identified friend from foe in the critical seconds before weapons were drawn. Sergeant Torres spun around, his M16 tracking toward the sound before recognition hit. "Master Chief, how the hell did you get here?" "Storm drains," Frank replied, already moving toward the wounded pilot. "Italian engineering from the 1930s. Bypasses every militia position between here and base." Chief Warrant Officer Danny Sullivan, the same man who would battle cancer in a VA hospital 17 years later, lay unconscious against the far wall, his flight suit dark with blood from internal injuries sustained in the crash. Beside him, Chief Warrant Officer Marcus Rodriguez showed signs of severe concussion, his eyes unfocused despite being semi-conscious. Staff Sergeant Kevin Park sat with his back against a concrete pillar, his left leg bent at an unnatural angle from a compound fracture sustained during the emergency landing. 2 Army Rangers, Private First Class Tommy Chen and Specialist David Martinez, maintained defensive positions at the windows, their ammunition running low after 4 hours of intermittent firefights. Frank knelt beside the pilot, his experienced hands checking pulse, respiration, and the subtle signs of internal bleeding that could kill a man long before enemy bullets found their mark. 26 years of combat medicine had taught him to read the body's distress signals with the precision of a physician. "Pilot's got internal hemorrhaging," Frank reported, his voice carrying the calm authority that steadied young soldiers in crisis situations. "Probably ruptured spleen from impact trauma. Co-pilot's got severe concussion, but vital signs are stable. Park, that leg needs immediate stabilization. Can you get us out of here, Master Chief?" Torres asked, hope and desperation warring in his voice. Frank glanced toward the windows, where militia fighters maintained sporadic fire from positions across the street. The conventional extraction route would require fighting through 2 city blocks of urban terrain while carrying wounded soldiers. A mission that would cost lives, even if it succeeded. But the storm drain that had brought him here could also take them home. "How much do your wounded weigh?" Frank asked. Torres looked confused. "Sir?" "The pilot and co-pilot. Combined weight, maybe 350–400 pounds total." Frank nodded, his mind calculating load factors, water displacement, and the complex physics of moving unconscious men through flooded tunnels. It would be the most challenging rescue of his career, but not impossible. "Rangers, we're going swimming." What followed was a masterpiece of special operations technique applied to an impossible situation. Frank Morrison had spent 3 decades perfecting the art of underwater rescue, but never before had he attempted to evacuate 5 wounded soldiers through a flooded tunnel system while hostile forces controlled the terrain above. The first challenge was medical stabilization. The pilot needed immediate fluid replacement to compensate for internal bleeding, while the co-pilot required careful monitoring to prevent additional trauma to his already damaged brain. Frank used the medical supplies from his waterproof kit to establish IV lines and stabilize cervical spines with the precision that had made him legendary among SEAL medics. The second challenge was logistics. Moving unconscious men through 8 feet of flowing water required specialized equipment that Frank didn't have: flotation devices, stretchers, and the additional personnel necessary for a safe evacuation. Instead, he improvised with materials scavenged from the crashed helicopter, life vests from the crew compartment, cargo straps from the equipment bay, and survival blankets that could be waterproofed with electrical tape. The third challenge was tactical. The militia fighters above had grown suspicious of the quiet compound and were beginning to probe the building's defenses. Time was running out, and any delay would compromise the entire extraction. "Torres," Frank said quietly, "I need you and your rangers to create a diversion, something that will draw attention to the upper floors while we move the wounded through the basement." "What kind of diversion, Master Chief?" Frank's gray eyes held the cold calculation of a man who had made similar decisions in Vietnam, the North Atlantic, and a dozen classified missions that would remain secret for another generation. The kind that makes them think you're preparing for a last stand. 20 minutes later, the sound of concentrated rifle fire erupted from the compound's upper floors as the three able-bodied rangers created the impression of a desperate defensive action. Militia fighters responded by focusing their attention on the windows and rooftops, exactly as Frank had predicted. In the basement, Master Chief Morrison began the most complex evacuation of his career. The pilot went first. Frank had fashioned a rescue harness from cargo straps and life preservers that would keep Sullivan's head above water while allowing Frank to tow him through the tunnel system. The fourth line remained connected, protected by waterproof tape and sheer determination. The descent into the drainage shaft was terrifying, lowering an unconscious man through 15 feet of vertical concrete while maintaining medical stability and tactical silence. But Frank's hands moved with the steady precision of 3 decades' experience, and Danny Sullivan disappeared into the underground system, still breathing, still alive, still savable. The co-pilot followed 20 minutes later, secured in a similar harness, but with additional cervical stabilization to protect his damaged brain from the trauma of water movement. Marcus Rodriguez regained consciousness during the descent, his eyes wide with confusion and fear, but Frank's quiet voice provided the anchor of authority that kept panic at bay. "Stay calm, son. You're going home." Staff Sergeant Park presented different challenges. His broken leg made conventional rescue techniques impossible, but his consciousness allowed for communication and cooperation. Frank fashioned a different type of harness that immobilized the fracture while providing enough buoyancy to keep Park stable during the underground transit. "Master Chief," Park whispered as they prepared for descent, "if something happens to me down there—" "Nothing's going to happen," Frank replied with absolute conviction. "I've been doing this since before you were born." The final 2 rangers, Chen and Martinez, would accompany Frank through the tunnel system under their own power, providing security and assistance during the extraction. Both men were strong swimmers. Both had complete confidence in their Master Chief. And both understood that success depended on following orders without question or hesitation. At 8:47 p.m., exactly 4 hours after the Black Hawk crash, Master Chief Frank Morrison led 5 wounded soldiers into the storm drainage system beneath Mogadishu for the most perilous journey of their lives. The return trip was a nightmare of endurance and technique. Frank towed 3 wounded men through flowing water while navigating by compass through the concrete maze. The pilot's condition deteriorated. Twice Sullivan stopped breathing, and twice Frank performed rescue breathing while treading water in the flooded storm drain. Staff Sergeant Park's broken leg created complications, making him completely dependent on Frank's strength. The 2 rangers provided crucial assistance during dangerous sections, forming human chains through rapids that would have been fatal without support. 43 minutes after entering the compound, Frank Morrison emerged with 5 living soldiers who had been written off as casualties. Colonel Webb was waiting. "Master Chief," Webb said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "you directly disobeyed my explicit orders. You compromised operational security and violated every principle of military discipline." Frank looked up with gray eyes that held no regret. "Sir, 5 American soldiers are alive who would otherwise be dead." "That's not the point." "You follow orders, period." "Yes, sir," Frank replied quietly. "And sometimes following orders means choosing which orders matter most." Webb stared at him, recognizing the authority that came from 26 years of life and death decisions. But legends didn't excuse insubordination. "You're confined to quarters pending court-martial proceedings for willful disobedience." Frank nodded, accepting consequences with calm professionalism. "Understood, sir." 3 weeks later, when Danny Sullivan had recovered enough to debrief, he told a story that transformed insubordination into heroism. The wounded soldiers' testimonies painted a picture of a Master Chief who had risked his career to save their lives. The solution was typically military in its complexity. Frank was formally reprimanded for disobeying orders, ending his career advancement. But he was also awarded the Bronze Star for extraordinary heroism. Frank accepted both the reprimand and the medal with equal equanimity. Some prices were worth paying. Had saved 5 American lives. Frank accepted both the reprimand and the medal with equal equanimity. At 51 years old, with 26 years of service and a collection of decorations that told stories most people would never hear, he understood that some prices were worth paying. The Bronze Star joined the Silver Star from Vietnam and the classified medals from operations that would remain secret for another generation. But more importantly, 5 families received phone calls telling them that their sons, husbands, and fathers were coming home alive. That was worth any price the military could exact. The VA Medical Center had grown quiet as afternoon shifted toward evening. Danny Hayes' breathing had stabilized, the cancer treatments showing signs of progress. Frank Morrison sat beside his old friend's bed, 2 aging warriors whose bond had been forged in flooded tunnels beneath a hostile city. "You never told me," Danny said quietly. "What happened after Somalia? The reprimand, the medal, how did you live with that?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folding in his lap as he considered the question. "I learned something in that storm drain," Frank finally replied. "Sometimes being right and being wrong happen at exactly the same time. Webb was right. I violated orders and set a dangerous precedent, but I was right too. 5 American soldiers came home alive who wouldn't have otherwise. So how do you live with that?" Frank's gray eyes held the accumulated wisdom of 30 years in special operations. You live with it by understanding that some decisions are too important to leave to other people. You live with it by accepting that doing the right thing and doing the legal thing aren't always the same. And you live with it by knowing that when you're standing at that moment where orders and conscience collide, the only person who has to sleep with the choice is you. Danny closed his eyes, a slight smile crossing his face for the first time in weeks. "Well, Master Chief, for what it's worth, I'm glad you chose conscience." Frank nodded once, the same gesture he'd made when accepting Colonel Webb's reprimand 26 years earlier. "So am I, son. So am I." Outside, the sun set over Sacramento, painting the sky the same golden color that had illuminated the storm drains beneath Mogadishu during the most important rescue of Frank Morrison's career. The Bronze Star in his jacket pocket caught the last light, a medal that represented both triumph and consequence, both heroism and insubordination. Some prices, Frank reflected, were worth paying twice over. The young Army lieutenant passed by again, glancing dismissively at the 2 old veterans lost in their memories. But this time, Frank Morrison didn't see disrespect in that look. He saw the same challenge that had faced him in Vietnam, Somalia, in every impossible moment where courage met consequence. The young lieutenant would learn, as Frank had learned, that some lessons could only be taught by experience. And someday, when orders and conscience collided in his own life, he would understand why a 51-year-old Master Chief had chosen 5 lives over military discipline in the flooded tunnels beneath Mogadishu. That understanding, Frank knew, was worth more than any medal the military could award. The story ended where it had begun, with an old warrior choosing lives over rules, conscience over command, and the eternal truth that real heroism happened not in the moment of recognition, but in the quiet decision to do what was right regardless of the cost. Master Chief Frank Morrison had made that choice in Vietnam, Somalia, and dozens of classified missions that would never make the history books. But the choice that mattered most was still ahead of him. The next moment when someone's life would depend on whether experience chose caution or courage. Frank Morrison would be ready.